Look at those hands. Bet she got those in a back alley knife fight over a bottle of cheap gin." The voice was a low, arrogant drawl, designed to carry just far enough. Cadet First Class Julian Miller leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched the old woman ladle soup into a bowl. His two companions, Cadets Renner and Croft, snickered into their hands, their crisp, white uniforms a stark contrast to the woman's faded gray kitchen smock. The grand mess hall of the Ares Naval Academy, a chamber of vaulted ceilings and hallowed tradition, seemed to shrink around their small circle of contempt. The woman, Alara, did not flinch. Her movements were economical, precise. She placed the bowl on the counter with a quiet click, her gaze remaining fixed on her task. The hands Miller had targeted were a roadmap of healed-over trauma. A web of silvery, puckered scars crisscrossed her forearms, disappearing beneath the rolled-up sleeves of her smock. One particularly deep, jagged line ran from her wrist almost to her elbow, a pale, dead river on her weathered skin. Miller, emboldened by her silence, pushed his tray forward. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby tables. "Where'd a woman like you pick up decorations like that? Fall into a threshing machine?" Alara lifted her eyes. They were a startlingly clear shade of gray, the color of a winter sea, and they held a depth that seemed to absorb the light in the room. There was no anger in them, only a profound stillness, a weariness that went beyond mere physical fatigue. She looked at the boy, and to her, he was just a boy, playing at being a man in a uniform he had yet to earn, and offered no reply. Her silence was a vacuum, and Miller's arrogance rushed to fill it. He was at the top of his class, a legacy cadet whose father was a decorated captain. He moved through these halls as if he owned them, convinced that his destiny was etched into the very granite of the institution. To him, this woman was nothing more than a piece of scenery, a menial laborer whose only purpose was to serve him and his future command. He saw the scars not as a history, but as a defect, a sign of a low and violent life lived far from the hallowed discipline of the Navy. "What's the matter? Cack out your tongue," Miller taunted, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Or did you lose that in the same fight that ruined your arms?" Renner and Croft laughed openly now. The sound was sharp and ugly in the dignified hall, where portraits of decorated admirals stared down from the walls with painted solemnity. Alara picked up the next bowl, her expression unchanged. But for a fleeting moment, a muscle in her jaw tightened. It was the only sign that his words had registered at all. She moved with an unhurried grace, a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate Miller even more. It was a shield his insults couldn't penetrate. He saw it as defiance from a social inferior, an unacceptable breach of the unspoken hierarchy. He was a future officer. She was a server. She was supposed to be invisible, or at the very least, cowed. This quiet resistance was an affront. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more venomous than his shouts. "You know, they don't just let anyone work here. This is a place of honor. People have standards. Maybe someone should check your record. See what kind of gutter you crawled out of to get here." Around them, the low hum of conversation had begun to falter. Other cadets were watching now, their faces a mixture of amusement, discomfort, and curiosity. They saw the confrontation. The promising, handsome Cadet Miller, a leader among his peers, and the silent, scarred kitchen worker. The power dynamic seemed obvious, the outcome preordained. They were witnessing a casual act of cruelty, the sort of thing that happened when young men full of pride and privilege felt entitled to sharpen their teeth on the world. Alara finished serving the cadet behind Miller and finally turned her full attention to him. She did not speak. She simply held his gaze. In the depths of her eyes, something flickered, not fear, not anger, but a vast, sorrowful knowledge. It was a look that spoke of fire and ice, of pressure and pain, of things Miller, in his starched uniform and polished shoes, could not possibly comprehend. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced his bravado. He felt an unsettling chill, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff he hadn't known was there. He had expected her to crumble, to apologize, to scurry away. He had not expected this silent, unshakable composure. It was like shouting at a mountain. The mountain did not care. It had endured far worse than the sound of his voice. The confrontation lingered in the air, a sour note in the symphony of the lunchtime rush. Miller, having failed to elicit the desired reaction, retreated to his table with a frustrated huff, his friends trailing behind him like pilot fish. He sat down heavily, slamming his tray onto the polished wood. "Can you believe the nerve of that woman?" he fumed, stabbing a piece of meat with his fork. "Just staring at me like that. Who does she think she is?" Croft, ever the sycophant, nodded eagerly. "No respect. That's the problem with civilians. They don't understand the chain of command. They don't understand discipline." Renner, slightly more perceptive, shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, Julian. There was something about her, the way she looked at you. It was unsettling. Miller scoffed, his confidence returning now that he was safely insulated by his peers. "It was insolence. She's probably some ex-con the Navy hired for cheap labor. The scars are probably from her last prison shanking." He tore off a piece of bread, his movements aggressive. But Renner's seed of doubt had taken root. Miller found his gaze drifting back to the serving line. Alara was still there, moving with the same steady, deliberate rhythm. She wiped down the stainless steel counter, her scarred hands working with a practiced efficiency. As she turned, the cuff of her smock slipped down, revealing more of her left wrist. For a moment, a sliver of dark ink was visible against her pale skin. It was a tattoo, old and faded, the lines blurred with time and the stretching of scarred tissue. It wasn't a skull or a pin-up girl or any of the common designs he'd seen on grizzled old sailors. It looked like a bird of prey, maybe an eagle or a hawk, its wings folded, clutching something in its talons. And below it, almost illegible, were 3 small, blocky letters. He couldn't make them out from this distance. It was just a smudge of forgotten history. Miller dismissed it. A stupid tattoo from a misspent youth, nothing more. Yet, he couldn't shake the image of her eyes. There was a command in them, a quiet authority that had no place in a kitchen worker. He had seen that look before, but not here. He'd seen it in the portraits on the walls. He'd seen it in the eyes of his own father, a man who had navigated his destroyer through typhoons and hostile waters. It was the look of someone who had faced down chaos and emerged, forever changed, on the other side. The thought was so absurd, so incongruous with the woman in the gray smock, that he laughed it off. He was letting her get to him. He was Julian Miller, and she was a nobody. The incident became the talk of the mess hall for the next few days. Miller, sensing he had an audience, amplified the story. He painted himself as the defender of the Academy's honor, confronting a disrespectful civilian who didn't appreciate the sanctity of the institution. Alara became a caricature in his retellings, a hardened, surly woman who probably spat in the soup. The rookies, eager to align themselves with a charismatic upperclassman, joined in the mockery. They began to call her Captain Scar, their voices dripping with sarcasm as they passed her in the line. They would hold out their trays and ask if the food was safe for consumption. Through it all, Alara remained a silent sentinel. She served the soup. She wiped the counters. She collected the trays. Her dignity was a fortress, her silence a language they did not understand. She moved through their ridicule as if it were a light mist, an inconvenience that could not touch her. Her resilience only made them crueler. They began to see it as a game, a test of wills. How far could they push her before she finally broke? One afternoon, Miller decided to escalate. He waited until the hall was at its most crowded, filled with cadets and a few junior instructors. He walked up to the serving line, not with a tray, but with a pristine white naval glove in his hand. He stopped directly in front of Alara. The hall quieted, sensing a spectacle. Miller held up the glove. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice ringing with theatrical formality. "A person's character is reflected in their appearance. In our world, we value precision, discipline, and flawlessness." He gestured around at the immaculate hall, the polished brass, the perfect uniforms. "Your condition," he said, flicking his gaze dismissively over her arms, "is an affront to that standard. It is a mark of disorder, of chaos." He then did the unthinkable. He took the white glove and, with a look of theatrical disgust, dropped it onto the counter in front of her. It landed on a damp spot with a soft, wet sound. "I am challenging you," he announced, a smirk on his face. "Not to a duel, of course, but to a standard of decency. Either clean up your act, or find work somewhere more suited to your background. A scrapyard, Perhaps the insult was so profound, so deeply personal, that a wave of shocked whispers rippled through the hall. Even Renner and Croft looked uncomfortable. This had gone beyond casual hazing. This was a public, deliberate humiliation. Alara looked down at the soiled white glove. Then she looked up at Miller. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't shame. It was pity. A deep, sorrowful pity for the boy standing before her, so blind in his own brilliance, so utterly ignorant of the world he claimed to understand. She slowly reached out, not for the glove, but for the soup ladle. She dipped it into the steaming tureen and held it out. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, yet it carried across the silent hall. "You must be very hungry," she said, her words simple, direct, and utterly disarming. "Eat something. You'll feel better." The response was a masterstroke of moral jujitsu. It refused to engage with his attack, instead offering a gesture of pure, maternal care. It recast his elaborate performance as a childish tantrum. Miller stood there, stunned into silence. He had expected tears, a protest, a retreat. He had not expected this quiet, unshakable grace. He had brought a sword to a battle of spirits, and his blade had passed through her like smoke. He was left looking foolish, his grand gesture collapsing into a puddle of petty cruelty. He felt hundreds of eyes on him, and for the first time, the judgment in them was not aimed at the old woman, but at him. He had overplayed his hand. He had revealed not her weakness, but his own profound immaturity. He snatched the glove off the counter and stormed away, his face burning with a shame he had never before experienced. The fortress of his pride had been breached, not by a counterattack, but by a simple, quiet act of mercy. The air in the mess hall remained thick with the aftermath of Miller's failed gambit. The cadets ate in a subdued quiet, the usual boisterous chatter replaced by murmurs and sideways glances. Miller sat with his back to the serving line, his posture rigid, the humiliated glove stuffed deep into his pocket. He was a king who had just been laughed out of his own court, and the silence of his subjects was more damning than any jeer. He had sought to make Alara small, but had only succeeded in diminishing himself. From that day on, the dynamic shifted. The overt mockery ceased. The Captain Scar nickname was no longer spoken aloud. The rookies still avoided Alara's line when they could, but their avoidance was now born of discomfort and a dawning shame, not contempt. They had witnessed a clash and seen their champion, the confident and articulate Julian Miller, utterly disarmed by a poor, scarred woman who had refused to fight. They didn't understand what had happened, but they knew they had been on the wrong side of it. Alara, for her part, seemed unchanged by the event. She continued her duties with the same quiet focus as always. If she noticed the new, wary respect in the cadets' eyes, she gave no sign. She was a constant, a fixed point in their turbulent world of drills, exams, and relentless pressure. She served the soup. She wiped the counters. She existed beyond their judgment. But the incident had planted a seed of inquiry. Who was she? Where had she come from? A few of the more curious cadets tried to look her up in the Academy's civilian employee database. They found nothing. Her file was sealed, accessible only by top-level command clearance. This was highly unusual. Even the groundskeepers and maintenance staff had basic public files. A sealed file for a kitchen worker was unheard of. It was a lock on a door that shouldn't have even been there. The mystery only deepened the cadets' unease. They started watching her more closely, not with derision, but with a new, speculative curiosity. They noticed things they hadn't before. The way she stood, perfectly balanced, her weight distributed evenly, like a martial artist at rest. The way her eyes constantly scanned the room, not in a paranoid way, but with a calm, comprehensive awareness, noting every entrance and exit. The unnatural stillness of her hands when she wasn't working, a sign of immense self-control. These were not the mannerisms of a simple cook. They were the ingrained habits of a warrior. One evening, a week after the glove incident, a powerful storm rolled in from the sea. The lights in the mess hall flickered and died, plunging the cavernous room into near-total darkness. A wave of panic rippled through the younger cadets. In the blackness, a chair scraped, a tray clattered to the floor, and a freshman cried out in alarm. Then, a voice cut through the chaos. It was Alara's. "Stay calm," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed an immediate, unquestionable authority. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed in moments of extreme stress. Remain in your seats. The emergency generators will activate in 10 seconds. 9. 8-inch, she counted down with the calm, rhythmic precision of a bomb disposal expert. Her voice was a beacon in the dark, a point of certainty in the sudden confusion. The cadets fell silent, their panic subsiding, their attention fixed on the disembodied voice. 3. 2. 1 inch exactly on her final word. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the hall in a pale, eerie glow. Alara was standing by the serving line, completely unfazed. In her hand was a small, powerful flashlight she had produced from a pocket in her smock. She had already been moving towards the main exit, her path sure and steady even in the complete darkness. The junior instructor on duty, a young lieutenant who had been fumbling for his phone, stared at her with wide, astonished eyes. "Ma'am," he stammered, instinctively using the term of respect. "How did you?" Alara simply switched off her flashlight and tucked it away. "Old habits," she said quietly, and went back to wiping down a counter as if nothing had happened. The incident was small, but it was another piece of the puzzle. The sealed file. The warrior's posture. The voice of command in a crisis. The cadets, especially Miller, began to feel they were standing in the presence of a profound and unsettling secret. The woman they had mocked and belittled was not what she seemed. She was something more, something other. The weight of their ignorance pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating. Miller found he could no longer meet her gaze. When he went through her line, he would stare at his tray, his face flushed, mumbling a perfunctory, "Thank you." He half expected her to say something, to call him out for his past cruelty. She never did. She just served him his food with the same quiet impartiality she showed everyone. Her forgiveness, unspoken and unearned, was more punishing than any reprimand could have been. It forced him to live with the full measure of his own disgrace. He had not just been wrong, he had been a fool. And the worst part was, he still had no idea just how big a fool he had been. The day of the annual fleet review was the most important day on the Ares Naval Academy calendar. It was a day of starched uniforms, gleaming brass, and unwavering precision. The grounds were immaculate, the cadets stood in perfect formation, and the air crackled with anticipation. This year was special. The guest of honor was Fleet Admiral Thaddeus Hayes, a living legend. A 5-star admiral, the highest possible rank, Hayes was the supreme commander of naval operations, a man whose strategic brilliance had shaped global naval policy for 2 decades. He was a titan, a figure of almost mythic proportions to the young men and women who dreamed of following in his footsteps. His portrait hung in the mess hall, a stern, unyielding gaze watching over them as they ate. For him to visit Ares was like a god descending from Olympus. The cadets had been drilling for this day for months. Miller, as the top-ranked cadet in his class, had a position of honor at the front of the formation. His uniform was perfect, his shoes were mirrors, and his expression was a mask of focused intensity. Yet, beneath the surface, his mind was turbulent. He kept seeing Alara's calm, gray eyes. He kept hearing her voice counting down in the darkness. The mystery of the kitchen worker had become an obsession, a piece of cognitive dissonance he couldn't resolve. The ceremony began. Speeches were made. Medals were presented. The air was filled with the proud traditions of the Navy. Finally, the moment arrived. Admiral Hayes stepped up to the podium. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his face a testament to a life spent at sea and in command. His uniform was laden with more ribbons and medals than Miller could count. When he spoke, his voice was like granite, a low, powerful rumble that commanded absolute attention. He spoke of duty, of honor, of the sacred trust placed in them as future officers. "The uniform does not make the warrior," Hayes boomed, his eyes sweeping across the sea of young faces. "The warrior makes the uniform. It is not the rank on your collar or the stripes on your sleeve that define you. It is the courage in your heart and the sacrifices you are willing to make when no one is watching." His gaze seemed to linger on Miller for a moment, and Miller felt a familiar, uncomfortable heat rise in his cheeks. After the address, the formal part of the day concluded, and a reception was to be held in the grand mess hall. The cadets were dismissed to prepare. As they filed into the hall, they found it transformed. White tablecloths adorned the tables, and civilian staff, brought in for the occasion, served refreshments. Alara was not there. Miller felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. The reception was a formal, stilted affair. Cadets stood in awkward clusters, trying to look important, while senior officers networked and spoke in low, serious tones. Then, the doors to the hall swung open again. Admiral Hayes entered, flanked by two aides. A hush fell over the room. The Admiral did not move towards the receiving line or the podium. Instead, his eyes began to scan the room, a purposeful, searching look on his face. He seemed to be looking for someone specific. He passed by captains and commanders with a curt nod, his gaze sweeping past the ranks of eager cadets. He was on a mission. His search took him towards the back of the hall, near the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. And then he stopped. Miller followed his gaze. Standing just inside the doorway, holding a tray of clean glasses, was Alara. She was in her simple gray smock, a ghost from their daily lives appearing in this sacred, formal space. She had clearly just come through to restock the bar and had frozen upon seeing the assembly. Her eyes met the Admiral's across the crowded room. An expression of profound, weary recognition passed between them. It was the look of two veterans who had survived the same war, two people who shared a history that was invisible to everyone else in the room. Time seemed to stop. The low hum of conversation died away as everyone turned to see what had captured the five-star Admiral's unwavering attention. They saw their legendary commander staring at a kitchen lady. Miller's heart began to pound in his chest. A cold dread, sharp and terrible, began to creep up his spine. The Admiral took a step forward. Then another. He began to walk towards her, his stride as purposeful as if he were walking across the deck of his flagship. He cut a path through the sea of uniforms, ignoring the confused salutes and stunned expressions of the officers he passed. His aides looked bewildered, but they followed 2 paces behind him. The entire room held its breath. The only sound was the rhythmic click of the Admiral's shoes on the polished marble floor. He was walking towards Alara, towards Captain Scar, and he was not slowing down. The space between them closed until only a few feet remained. Hayes, the most powerful man in the Navy, stood before the humble, scarred woman in the gray smock. He did not look down on her. He looked at her as an equal. Admiral Hayes came to a halt directly in front of Alara. He stood a full head taller than her, a mountain of military authority and decorated history. But the look on his face was not one of superiority. It was one of profound, almost reverent, respect. He looked at her scarred hands, the ones Miller had so cruelly mocked, and his expression softened with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "It's been a long time, Spectre," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried across the dead-silent hall like a thunderclap. Spectre. It wasn't a name. It was a call sign. Alara gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Too long, Thad," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. Thad. She had called the 5-star Admiral by a nickname. The cadets and officers watched, their minds struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding before them. Miller felt the floor drop out from beneath him. His blood ran cold. He felt as if he were falling from a great height. Then, Admiral Hayes did something that shattered every conception of rank, protocol, and reality in that room. He straightened his back, his posture becoming ramrod straight. He brought his heels together with a sharp, audible click. His right hand rose in a salute so precise, so crisp, so utterly perfect that it seemed to carve the air. It was not the casual salute an admiral gives to a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a superior officer. It was the salute of a warrior to a legend. He held the salute, his gaze locked on Alara, his expression one of unwavering, absolute respect. Alara slowly, deliberately, placed the tray of glasses she was holding onto a nearby table. She turned back to the Admiral, her movements tired but sure. She raised her own scarred right hand and returned the salute, her form just as perfect, an echo of a discipline that had been burned into her very soul. The two of them stood there for a long moment, locked in a silent communion that transcended time and rank. The entire Naval Academy, from the rawest plebe to the most seasoned captain, stood as silent witnesses. Finally, the Admiral lowered his hand. He gestured to her scarred arms. "The Aegis incident," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I heard you didn't make it out. Reports were exaggerated," Alara said. a faint, wry smile touching her lips for the first time. They had to be. It was the only way to get clear. The Admiral nodded, his eyes filled with a story no one else in the room could read. He then turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the assembly of stunned faces until it landed, with crushing weight, on Cadet Julian Miller. The Admiral's eyes, which had been warm with respect for Alara, were now chips of ice. "Cadet Miller," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low growl. The boy snapped to attention, his body rigid with terror. "Yes." Admiral stepped forward. Miller obeyed, his legs feeling like lead. He walked the longest 10 yards of his life, stopping a few feet from the Admiral and the woman he had tormented. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, unable to look at either of them. "I have been made aware of your conduct in this hall," the Admiral said, his voice laced with cold fury. "I am told you have a great deal to say about scars. You seem to fancy yourself an expert on the subject." Miller's throat was dry. "Sir? No, sir." "Then allow me to provide you with an education," the Admiral snarled. He pointed to the long, jagged scar on Alara's left arm. "This scar she received pulling my son, a pilot, from the burning wreckage of his cockpit after he was shot down behind enemy lines. The fire melted the skin from her arms, but she did not let go until he was clear. My son is alive today because of this scar." He then pointed to a starburst of puckered flesh on her shoulder, visible just above the collar of her smock. "This one is from shrapnel. She took it when she shielded a wounded corpsman with her own body during an ambush. The corpsman lived to save 3 other men that day. She took the medal meant for him." His voice grew louder, resonating with a righteous anger that made the crystal glasses on the tables tremble. "Her hands, Cadet, the hands you found so disgusting, were burned by phosphorus while she was disabling an enemy munitions cache, saving an entire platoon from walking into a trap. Every mark on this woman is a medal of honor that you will never be qualified to polish. Each one was purchased with a currency of pain and courage you can't even begin to comprehend." The Admiral stepped closer to Miller, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This woman," he said, gesturing to Alara, "is Commander Alara Vance. Callsign Spectre. She was the founding member and field leader of Naval Special Operations Group 7, a unit so secret it doesn't officially exist. We sent her on missions that the history books will never record. She has fought in places you have never heard of, against enemies you will never know. She has sacrificed more for her country than anyone in this room. And when she was done, when she could sacrifice no more, she asked for only one thing: to be left in peace, to serve quietly, without fanfare. She chose to work in this kitchen to be near the memory of the service she loved and to watch over the next generation." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And you, in your arrogance and your ignorance, you chose to mock her. You stood in the presence of greatness and saw only a janitor. You looked at a living monument of heroism and saw only a target for your petty cruelty." Miller was shaking, tears of shame streaming down his face. He finally looked at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the quiet strength, the profound sorrow, the unyielding courage. He saw a hero, and he saw the person he had tried to break. The full, crushing weight of his transgression landed on him, and he felt himself begin to crumble. Miller's carefully constructed world had been obliterated. The foundations of his pride, his status, his entire sense of self-worth had been reduced to dust by the Admiral's devastating revelation. He stood there, exposed and ashamed, under the collective gaze of his peers and superiors. The silence in the hall was absolute, a heavy blanket of judgment. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He squeezed his eyes shut, unable to bear the weight of it all. "Admiral," a quiet voice said. It was Alara. She had stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the Admiral's arm. "That's enough." Admiral Hayes looked at her, the fury in his eyes softening as he met her calm, steady gaze. He took a deep, shuddering breath, reining in his protective rage. "He disrespected you, Alara. He disrespected everything you stand for." "He's a child," she replied, her voice devoid of malice. "He's a boy who has never seen the world outside these walls. He doesn't know. How could he?" She then turned her attention to the trembling cadet. She looked at Julian Miller, not with anger or contempt, but with that same profound, sorrowful pity she had shown him before. Her gaze was not a weapon, but a mirror, forcing him to see the ugliness of his own actions without condemnation from her. "Look at me, cadet," she said softly. Miller forced himself to open his eyes and meet her gaze. He expected to see hatred, a demand for retribution. He saw only a deep, quiet sadness. "The scars you see," she said, holding up her hands, "they are a part of me. They are my history. They do not hurt anymore. But the wounds you inflicted with your words, those are on you now. You must decide how you will carry them." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a moral truth delivered with gentle finality. She was not demanding an apology or a punishment. She was giving him a choice. He could let this moment of shame curdle into resentment and bitterness, or he could allow it to be the crucible in which a better man was forged. In that moment, something inside Julian Miller broke. Not his pride, which was already gone, but the hard shell of arrogance he had built around himself. For the first time, he saw the world not as a hierarchy to be climbed, but as a complex tapestry of hidden stories and silent struggles. He saw that true strength was not in a loud voice or a high rank, but in the quiet dignity of a woman who could endure mockery and respond with mercy. He took a shaky step forward and came to attention before her. His voice was choked with tears, but he forced the words out. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking. "Commander, there are no words. I am so sorry. My conduct was unforgivable." Alara simply nodded, accepting his apology without fanfare. "Forgiveness is not the issue, son," she said. "Understanding is. Remember this day. Remember that the world is filled with people whose stories you do not know. Judge slowly. Act with kindness. That is the beginning of honor." She then turned back to the Admiral. "Let him go, Thad. He's learned his lesson." Admiral Hayes stared at Miller for a long moment, his expression hard. But he finally gave a curt nod. "Commander Vance has pardoned you, cadet. The official punishment will be recorded as severe reprimand and counseling, but know this," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your real punishment will be to wake up every morning for the rest of your life and try to be worthy of the grace this woman has shown you. You will spend your career trying to earn the honor you so casually trampled upon today. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Admiral," Miller whispered, his head bowed. "Crystal clear, sir." "Dismissed," the Admiral commanded. Miller executed a shaky salute, turned, and walked away, not back to his friends, but straight out of the hall. He needed to be alone. He needed to figure out how to put the pieces of himself back together into the shape of a man Commander Vance might one day respect. The spell was broken. The crowd began to breathe again, murmuring in shocked tones. Admiral Hayes turned back to Alara. "You're too good for them, Spectre," he said softly. "You always were. They're just young," she repeated. "They'll learn. Or they won't. Our job was to give them a country safe enough to have the luxury of being foolish. It seems we succeeded." She picked up her tray of glasses. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Admiral, these people look thirsty." She gave him a small, knowing smile and disappeared back through the swinging doors into the kitchen, leaving a legend in her wake. The reception was effectively over. The lesson had been delivered, more powerfully than any speech from a podium. The cadets and officers slowly dispersed, their minds replaying the scene, their understanding of the world fundamentally altered. They now knew that heroes walked among them, hidden in plain sight, and that true honor was not always announced with trumpets and medals. Sometimes, it was found in the quiet dignity of a woman with scarred hands, serving soup in the mess hall. The days that followed the Fleet Review were marked by a profound and lasting change in the culture of the Ares Naval Academy. The story of what had happened in the mess hall spread like wildfire, first as whispered rumor, then as established, revered legend. It became known as the Admiral's Salute, a cautionary tale and a moral touchstone for generations of cadets to come. The Grand Hall, once just a place for meals, was now viewed with a certain reverence. The serving line where Commander Alara Vance had worked became a kind of hallowed ground. Cadets no longer saw a menial workspace. They saw the duty station of a silent giant. Alara, however, was gone. The day after the reception, she had quietly tendered her resignation. When the Academy's superintendent, a rear admiral who was still reeling from the events, had tried to refuse it, she had been firm. "My work here is done," she had told him. "The quiet is gone. It's time for me to find it somewhere else. She left without ceremony, without a forwarding address, disappearing back into the anonymity she cherished. She had not sought recognition, and when it was thrust upon her, she had simply moved on, a ghost slipping back into the mist. Her absence was a palpable presence. She had become more powerful as a memory than she had ever been in person. The cadets who had witnessed the event were forever changed. Renner and Croft, Miller's former cronies, became quieter, more thoughtful. They were often seen volunteering for the least desirable duties, as if performing a quiet penance. The casual cruelty of youth had been burned out of them, replaced by a cautious humility. They had learned that every face has a story, and some stories are epics hidden behind a veil of the ordinary. But the greatest transformation was in Julian Miller. He had been publicly dismantled, his arrogance stripped away to reveal the frightened, ignorant boy beneath. He had been offered a chance at redemption not through punishment, but through grace, and that mercy had become the defining principle of his life. He threw himself into his studies and his training with a new, desperate fervor. He was no longer driven by ambition or a desire for glory, but by a profound need to become a man worthy of Commander Vance's pardon. He graduated at the top of his class, but his valedictory speech was unlike any that had come before. He did not speak of victory, or strategy, or the proud traditions of the Navy. He spoke of humility. He spoke of kindness. And he told the story of a scarred woman who had served him soup and taught him the true meaning of honor. He never mentioned her name or rank, referring to her only as a quiet hero, but everyone in the hall knew exactly who he was talking about. Years passed. Julian Miller's career was exemplary. He rose through the ranks, earning a reputation not for reckless bravery or tactical genius, but for his quiet competence and his deep, unwavering care for the men and women under his command. He was known as an officer who listened, who judged slowly, and who always remembered that the lowest-ranking sailor scrubbing the deck might be carrying a history more profound than his own. He never forgot the lesson he had learned in the mess hall. It became the North Star of his moral compass. One gray afternoon, decades later, now Captain Miller stood on the bridge of his own command, a state-of-the-art guided missile destroyer. They were navigating a treacherous strait in hostile territory, the tension on the bridge a palpable thing. A young ensign, nervous and eager to impress, made a critical error in a navigational reading, nearly putting the ship at risk. The bridge officers turned on the boy, their voices sharp with criticism and fear. Miller held up a hand, silencing them. He walked over to the young man, who was pale and trembling, expecting to be relieved of duty, his career over before it had begun. Miller did not shout. He did not reprimand. He looked at the terrified ensign and saw a reflection of his younger self. He put a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. "What is the first lesson of command, ensign?" Miller asked, his voice calm and low. The ensign stammered. I don't know, sir. The first lesson," Miller said, his gaze becoming distant, as if looking back across the years into a sunlit mess hall, "is that we are all more than our worst mistake. Now, take a breath, correct your reading, and let's get back to work. We're counting on you." In that moment of quiet compassion, the legacy of Alara Vance lived on. It was not a legacy written in history books or carved into monuments. It was a legacy of quiet strength, of profound humility, and of a grace that could heal the deepest scars, both inside and out. It was a lesson passed down not in a lecture hall, but in a single, transformative act of mercy, a debt of honor being paid forward from one generation to the next, a quiet hero's gift to the future she had fought so hard to protect.